The rain had been falling for hours, soaking the black soil and turning the Afghan mountains into a maze of mud and mist. The sky was a dim grey, thick with smoke from distant artillery. Somewhere among those rocks and shattered villages, Sergeant Emily Carter lay flat on her stomach, her uniform caked with dust and blood. Her radio was dead, her rifle lost when the explosion threw her down the ravine. She was alone, unarmed, and miles from the extraction point. Her last memory of her team was a deafening blast, the flash of a roadside AD that had torn their convoy apart. She'd been thrown down the slope, hitting rocks and branches before losing consciousness. When she woke, the sun was already setting, and the voices of enemy fighters echoed through the valley. She had crawled through the underbrush until her hands were raw, hiding from shadows and praying the search parties would pass. She had no weapon, no food, and only a cracked canteen of water. Her heart pounded with every sound. Hours turned into a blur of fear and survival instinct. Emily pressed her ear to the ground. A rumble, distant but real. Not thunder, vehicles. She couldn't tell if they were American or Taliban. Her training told her to stay put, but her gut screamed to move. Slowly, painfully, she dragged herself toward higher ground. The ridge above was steep, her limbs trembling with exhaustion, but she forced herself up. At the top, the view opened wide, endless desert, broken mountains, and a narrow valley below lit by the orange flicker of campfires. She saw them, at least a dozen armed men moving around trucks. Taliban, her pulse spiked. They had found the wreckage of her convoy. She wanted to scream, but instead she sank back, tears mixing with rain. She thought of her team, Davis, the medic with the dry humor, Torres, who always hummed country songs, and Lieutenant Parker, who never let anyone feel afraid. They were gone. She didn't know if anyone else had survived. She whispered their names under her breath, promising she'd make it back for them. Hours passed. Her hands shook from cold and dehydration. She reached for her pocket. Inside was a folded photo of her parents and her younger brother back home in Iowa. She smiled weakly, tracing the edges of their faces with her thumb. "I'm not dying here," she whispered. By dawn the rain stopped. A pale light crept over the hills. Emily used what little energy she had left to move toward a cluster of rocks that offered better cover. She was dizzy, her body screaming for rest, but she refused to close her eyes. She knew if she slept, she might never wake up. Suddenly, the faint hum of rotors cut through the silence. Her heart leapt. "Helicopter!" She scrambled to her feet, waving her arms. "Over here, over here!" she shouted, her voice hoarse and weak. The helicopter grew louder, a black hawk skimming low over the terrain, but it veered away. She realized it couldn't see her through the clouds. Desperation surged through her. She tore off a piece of her uniform, soaked it in the remaining water from her canteen, and tied it to a stick she found nearby. She struck a flare from her pocket, miraculously unbroken, and waved it wildly. The red smoke spiraled upward, bright against the grey dawn. The helicopter hesitated, it turned, then it came back. Her knees buckled as she watched it circle and hover above the ridge. The downdraft from its blades blasted her with grit and wind. A voice crackled over a loudspeaker. "U.S. Forces, stay where you are." Emily collapsed, laughing and crying all at once. Two figures rappelled down, Navy SEALs in full combat gear. They ran to her, checking for wounds. "Sergeant Carter," one shouted through the roar. She nodded weakly. "You're safe now." The SEAL said, his voice steady, "We've got you." But safety was still far from guaranteed. As they strapped her into a harness, gunfire erupted from the valley below. The Taliban had seen the chopper. Bullets pinged off rocks, and one SEAL went down, hit in the shoulder. "We need to move," shouted the other. The pilot yelled something over the radio, and the helicopter tilted sideways, unleashing a burst from its mounted gun. Emily felt herself lifted, spinning upward as the SEALs fired back, the air filled with smoke and chaos. Her vision blurred from adrenaline and exhaustion. When they finally pulled her into the helicopter, she saw the wounded SEAL slumped beside her, his hands slick with blood. She tried to speak, but her throat closed up. One of the crew pressed oxygen against her face. "You're gonna be fine," he said, though his eyes said he wasn't sure. The Black Hawk surged forward, banking hard to avoid another volley of fire. Below, she could see the flash of explosions chasing them as they escaped the valley. Then silence, the gunfire faded. The mountains disappeared behind the clouds. Emily closed her eyes, clutching the photo in her pocket. She woke hours later at the field hospital. Bright white lights. The steady beeping of monitors. Her arm was bandaged, her body bruised, but she was alive. A nurse leaned over her. "You made it, Sergeant. The SEAL team brought you in just in time." Emily tried to speak, but her lips trembled. "My team," the nurse hesitated, then quietly said, "They're still searching, but you're safe now." Tears welled in her eyes. Safe. The word felt both comforting and cruel. Days turned into weeks as she recovered. She learned that 3 of her convoy members had been confirmed dead. 2 were missing, presumed captured. She felt the weight of survivor's guilt pressing down on her chest every night. The SEAL who was shot during her rescue, Petty Officer Miller, survived too, though he'd taken a bullet near the shoulder. When he came to visit her, his arm was in a sling. "You're tougher than you look," he said with a grin. "You gave us a hell of a signal to find." She smiled faintly. "You showed up when I needed you most." "That's what we do," he said. "No one gets left behind." They sat in silence for a moment, the noise of the camp outside blending with the soft hum of medical equipment. Emily looked down at her bandaged hands. "I thought I was done for. I didn't even have a weapon." Miller shook his head. "You didn't need one. You had the will to survive. That's what matters." When she was cleared to return home, she stood on the airstrip staring at the same kind of helicopter that had saved her. Its rotors spun slowly, the air thick with dust and memories. She thought of the men who hadn't made it, of the desert that had nearly swallowed her. She promised herself she'd live the rest of her life honoring them. On the flight back to the U.S., she looked out the window at the clouds below, the endless stretch of sky, and whispered a quiet thank you to her team, to the SEALs, to the universe that had given her one more chance. Months later, after her recovery, she visited Arlington. The names of her fallen comrades were etched into the marble. She placed a small photo at the base of one marker, the same picture she had kept in her pocket through that nightmare. "We made it out," she whispered, "at least part of us did." As she turned to leave, a familiar sound echoed above, the deep thrum of helicopter blades. She looked up, watching as it passed over the horizon. Her chest tightened with emotion. That sound no longer meant danger. It meant hope. It meant home. And somewhere, deep inside, she knew she would never forget the day she was left behind enemy lines, unarmed, broken, and afraid, until the SEAL helicopter came for her.